In 1981, scientists confirmed something that sounds impossible. An entire species of bird, once found across Japan, China, Korea, and Russia, had been reduced to just 7 individuals left alive on the entire planet. Not 7 left in Japan, not 7 left in one region, 7 left. Or period. Hiding in a remote mountain range in central China, unaware that they were the last chapter of a story that had already ended everywhere else. This is the story of the Crested Ibis, known in Japan as the Toki, and how a tiny remote island called Sado brought a species back from the very edge of extinction. Out of one of the most unlikely and quietly remarkable conservation stories of the last century. To understand how a bird ends up down to 7 individuals, you have to go back much further, to a time when this same bird was so common across East Asia that almost nobody paid it any special attention at all. The Crested Ibis is a striking bird. White and pale pink feathers, a long curved black beak, red skin around the face, and a distinctive crest of feathers at the back of its head. In Japan, its feathers were so specifically colored that the traditional color Toki iro, or ibis color, a soft pink shade, was named directly after the bird. It appears in old paintings, in family crests, in centuries of folklore. During Japan's Nara period, over 1,000 years ago, the Toki was already considered a bird of deep cultural significance. For most of Japanese history, the Crested Ibis wasn't rare at all. It lived across rice paddies and wetlands throughout the country, feeding on loaches, frogs, insects, and small fish found in the shallow, muddy water of cultivated rice fields. In many ways, the bird's fate was tied directly to the rice paddy itself. Where there were healthy wetlands and traditional farming, there were Toki. That relationship is exactly what started to unravel. During the Edo period, farmers began to see the Crested Ibis differently. Instead of being a quiet neighbor of the rice paddy, it was increasingly viewed as a nuisance, a bird that trampled crops and interfered with cultivation. That shift in perception mattered, because it meant fewer people saw any reason to protect the species when things started to go wrong. And things did start to go wrong, dramatically, in the 20th century. The first major blow was overhunting. Through the 19th century and into the early 20th, the Crested Ibis was hunted heavily, in part for its striking feathers, which were used decoratively. Populations that had once spread across the country began shrinking into smaller and smaller pockets. The second blow came from habitat loss. As Japan modernized, wetlands were drained, rice paddies were consolidated and reshaped for industrial farming, and the mountainous terrain the birds increasingly relied on for safety kept shrinking as development expanded into rural areas. The third blow, and in many ways the most devastating one, came in the form of chemistry. Starting in the 1950s, Japan began widespread use of agricultural pesticides. These chemicals didn't just fail to harm the Crested Ibis directly, they poisoned the entire food chain the bird depended on. The loaches, frogs, and insects living in those rice paddies absorbed the chemicals, and the Crested Ibis, eating those very same creatures every day, absorbed the poison right along with them. Toxicity built up in their bodies over time, weakening the birds and crippling their ability to reproduce successfully. By 1934, Japan had already noticed the alarming decline and officially designated the Crested Ibis a natural treasure, a form of protected status meant to safeguard what remained of the population. But protection on paper and protection in practice turned to be two very different things. Industrial development around protected zones wasn't meaningfully restricted, and the pesticide problem wasn't addressed at all. By 1957, only 11 individual Crested Ibises were known to remain in the entire country. 11. A number so small it's hard to even picture what a species clinging on by that thread actually looks like. In 1960, international conservation organizations classified the species as critically endangered, giving it a form of global protected status, but numbers kept sliding regardless. There were 2 known remaining strongholds in Japan by this point: Sado Island, off the coast of Niigata Prefecture, and the Noto Peninsula, further along Japan's western coast. In 1929, Crested Ibises had been confirmed living on a mountain called Bijozan on the Noto Peninsula. A decade later, a colony of around 17 or 18 birds was found there. It seemed, for a moment, like a stable population. By 1964, only 1 Crested Ibis remained on the entire Noto Peninsula, 1 bird, given the nickname Nori. In 1970, that single remaining bird was captured and transported to Sado Island, joining the small remnant population there because, at that point, there was simply nowhere else left for a lone Crested Ibis to survive. Meanwhile, on Sado itself, the population was collapsing in parallel. In 1965, conservationists attempted to raise 2 young ibises that had been captured on the island, hoping captive care might help stabilize numbers. Within a year, one of those 2 birds had died. When researchers performed an autopsy, they found pesticides embedded in its tissue, direct physical evidence of exactly what was killing this species from the inside out. That discovery led, in 1967, to the construction of the Sado Japanese Crested Ibis Conservation Center, built specifically to try to save whatever was left of the species inside Japan's borders. It wasn't enough. The wild population kept shrinking through the 70s. By 1981, only 5 wild crested ibises remained anywhere on Sado Island, and therefore anywhere in Japan. Kanzu. Conservationists made the difficult decision to capture all 5 of the remaining wild birds and bring them into the conservation center, ending, for all practical purposes, the presence of wild crested ibises in Japanese skies. Japan's captive breeding program with those final birds did not go well. Genetics, age, and the accumulated toll of decades of decline all worked against it, one by one. Over the following 2 decades, those last wild-born birds died. In October 2003, the very last of them, a female named Kin, died at the conservation center at 36 years old. With her death, the crested ibis, as a wild-born Japanese lineage, was gone completely. For a moment, it looked like this really was the end of the story. Extinct in Japan. And as far as most of the world knew, extinct everywhere else too. But roughly 2 decades earlier, in a place almost nobody was looking, something extraordinary had already happened. And it's the reason this story doesn't end in a museum display case. In 1981, ornithologists from the Institute of Zoology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences had been searching methodically across 9 different provinces in China, looking for any remaining trace of the crested ibis in the wild. The bird had been considered essentially gone from China too. Decades of searching by earlier researchers had turned up nothing. Then in a remote mountainous corner of Shanxi province, in the Qinling Mountains, they found them. 7 crested ibises, alive, surviving, undetected, in one of the most isolated pockets of habitat left on the entire continent. 7 birds. That was the entire known population of a species that had once ranged across an entire region of the world, spanning multiple countries. 7 birds represented the whole genetic future of the crested ibis, the last thread connecting an ancient, culturally significant species to any possible future at all. And what happened next is arguably the most important part of this story, because discovering 7 birds means nothing if nobody protects them properly from that point forward. China moved fast. A dedicated conservation and breeding program was established specifically around this rediscovered population, and unlike Japan's earlier unsuccessful attempts with its final wild birds, this effort actually worked. Researchers carefully managed breeding. Pairs protected the surrounding habitat and slowly, patiently, began growing the population back from that impossibly small starting point. As the population in China began to recover, an idea started forming that would eventually connect this rediscovery directly back to Sado Island on the other side of the sea, where the empty conservation center sat as a quiet monument to what Japan had lost. Diplomacy and conservation ended up intertwining in a way that rarely happened so cleanly. China began that's sometimes described as a form of animal diplomacy, similar in spirit to its long tradition of panda diplomacy, offering crested ibises as gifts to other nations as a gesture of goodwill, paired with a genuine conservation partnership. Japan received its first breeding pair from China as part of this effort, sent specifically to the Sado Japanese Crested Ibis Conservation Center, the same facility built decades earlier to house Japan's own dying population. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone involved. The very place that had watched Japan's last wild crested ibis die was now the starting point for the species' return. Artificial breeding with these Chinese gifted birds took years of careful, patient work. It wasn't a quick fix. Researchers had to relearn breeding techniques, manage genetics carefully to avoid the kind of narrow gene pool that dooms small populations, and slowly build confidence that captive-bred chicks could actually survive and eventually thrive. That breakthrough finally came in the early 2000s. Breeding at the Sado Center succeeded, chicks hatched, survived, and grew. For the first time in decades, there were young crested ibises alive in Japan again, even if only within the walls of a conservation facility. But the real turning point, the moment this story shifts from simply preserving a species in captivity to actually restoring it to the wild, came in 2008. That year, for the first time, artificially bred crested ibises raised at the Sado Center were released directly into the wild on the island. Not into cages, not into enclosures, into the actual sky above Sado, the same sky their ancestors had disappeared from a generation earlier. This wasn't a one-time symbolic gesture either. Since 2008, releases have continued twice a year, gradually building an actual free living population on the island rather than a purely captive one. The most important milestone, the one that proved this entire effort had genuinely worked and wasn't just captive breeding dressed up as conservation, came in 2012. That year, chicks hatched from wild, free-living crested ibises on Sado Island itself, not from parents in captivity, but from birds that had been released years earlier and had now bred entirely on their own in the wild without human intervention. 3 chicks, born in the wild, on the same island where, less than a decade earlier, the very last wild-born crested ibis in the country had died. This was the first time in nearly 40 years that a wild crested ibis had hatched anywhere in Japan. Take a moment with that timeline. Extinct in the wild in Japan by 2003. Chicks hatching in the wild again on the very same island by 2012. Less than a decade separating the lowest point the species ever reached in Japan from genuine, self-sustaining recovery. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. It happened because an entire community on Sado Island fundamentally changed how it farmed. Remember, one of the core reasons the crested ibis nearly disappeared in the first place was pesticide-laden rice, farming poisoning its food supply. If Sado wanted these released birds to actually survive and reproduce in the wild, farming on the island had to change, not just conservation policy on paper, but the actual daily practices of local rice farmers. That's exactly what happened. Farmers across Sado Island began shifting toward environmentally friendly cultivation methods, dramatically reducing chemical pesticide use in their rice paddies, specifically to protect the returning crested ibis population. This wasn't imposed from some distant government office. It was a genuine community-wide shift, driven by farmers who understood that the survival of this bird was now directly tied to how they grew their own crops. In 2011, this relationship between traditional agriculture and crested ibis conservation earned international recognition. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization designated Sado Island's Satoyama landscape, its traditional rural agricultural land, as a globally important agricultural heritage system. Alongside the Noto Peninsula, this marked the first time this kind of UN designation had been given to a location inside an industrially advanced nation, recognition specifically tied to how the island's farming practices supported crested ibis habitat. The results kept building. Local schoolchildren on Sado now grow up watching crested ibises forage in rice paddies near their own schools, an ordinary everyday sight that would have been genuinely unthinkable to their grandparents' generation, who watched the same bird vanish entirely. By around 2020, the rewilded crested ibis population on Sado Island had grown to roughly 450 birds, living and breeding freely across the island. A population that started with 7 individuals discovered by chance in a remote Chinese mountain range, and then rebuilt almost from scratch on an island where the species had already gone completely extinct. The international cooperation behind this recovery kept expanding too. In 2008, China's then president personally gifted a breeding pair of crested ibises to South Korea, where a dedicated restoration center was established in Changnyeong. Chicks hatched there the following year, and within less than a decade, that center's population had grown into the hundreds as well, with its own plans eventually moving toward releasing birds into the wild in Korea. Back on Sado, the conservation partnership between China and Japan continued well beyond the original gift decades earlier. Additional breeding pairs were exchanged in later years, specifically to strengthen the genetic diversity of the growing population and avoid the risks that come with rebuilding a species from such a narrow starting pool of individuals. Officials from both countries have publicly framed this ongoing exchange as a symbol of cooperation between two nations, built entirely around the shared goal of keeping the species alive. And the recovery hasn't stopped at Sado's shoreline either. In more recent years, conservation efforts have expanded the crested ibis's range back toward the Noto Peninsula, the very region where the species' Japanese decline had once been sealed by the loss of its last remaining bird back in 1964. Releases have taken place there as well, in ceremonies that carry heavy symbolic weight, restoring the species to landscapes that had been erased from generations earlier. Think about what this actually represents. A species reduced to a single-digit population, 7 individuals, found essentially by chance in one of the most remote corners of a single country. No backup population, no safety net, no wild individuals anywhere else on the planet that anyone knew of. If those 7 birds had been found even a few years later, if a landslide, an illness, or simple bad luck had taken even 2 or 3 of them before they were discovered, the story ends completely differently. There is no version of this recovery that happens without those 7 specific birds surviving long enough to be found, protected, and bred. It's worth understanding exactly why this particular bird was so vulnerable in the first place, because it explains a great deal about why its recovery required such a specific, patient approach, rather than a quick fix. Crested ibises are what conservationists call a habitat specialist. They don't thrive in just any environment. They need shallow wetlands and flooded rice paddies to forage in, tall trees nearby for nesting and de-roosting, and a steady supply of small aquatic prey like loaches, frogs, crabs, and insects. Remove any one of those pieces, drain the wetlands, cut down the nesting trees, or poison the food supply, and the bird simply cannot survive there anymore, no matter how much surrounding land remains untouched. This is exactly why traditional Satayama landscapes, the patchwork of rice paddies, ponds, and woodland, historically maintained by rural Japanese farming communities, had been such reliable ibis habitat for centuries. It's also exactly why modernizing that same landscape, consolidating fields, draining smaller wetlands, and introducing industrial pesticides hit the species so hard and so fast. The crested ibis wasn't just losing individual birds to hunting, it was losing the entire functioning ecosystem it depended on to survive at all. That distinction matters enormously for understanding why Sado's recovery effort had to go so far beyond simply breeding birds in captivity. You can hatch as many chicks as you want inside a conservation center, but releasing them into a landscape that still can't support them accomplishes nothing. The habitat itself had to be actively rebuilt and maintained, which is precisely why the shift toward pesticide-free, ibis-friendly rice farming across the island wasn't a side project. It was the actual foundation the entire recovery depended on. There's also a cultural dimension to this story worth sitting with. The crested ibis isn't just another endangered species to the people of Japan. It carries centuries of symbolic weight tied to the imperial H household, to traditional artwork, to the very name of a specific shade of pink still used in the Japanese language Ia today. Losing this particular bird would have meant losing a living link to a much older cultural identity, not simply losing a line item from a biodiversity index. That cultural weight is part of why the eventual partnership with China carried so much symbolic significance beyond the pure biology of it. When Chinese officials handed over that first breeding pair to the empty conservation center on Sado, it wasn't simply a transfer of two birds between countries. It was, quite literally, handing back a piece of Japan's own cultural heritage that Japan itself had lost, made possible only because a separate population had quietly survived, undetected, just across the sea. None of this recovery was ever guaranteed to work, and it's worth remembering how many points along this timeline could have gone differently. The two young ibises Japan attempted to raise in captivity back in 1965 could have both survived, potentially masking just how severe the pesticide problem already was. China's 9-province search in 1981 could have come back empty, just as earlier searches had. Genetic problems for OM, breeding an entire recovered population from just 7 founding individuals, could have caused the kind of inbreeding depression that quietly dooms small, rebuilt populations decades later. Any of these turning points breaking the wrong way would have meant a very different ending to this story, likely one without any wild crested ibises left anywhere on the planet at all. What makes the Sado story particularly remarkable isn't just the raw number of birds recovered, it's the fact that a genuinely large-scale, systemic problem, chemical-heavy industrial agriculture, reshaping how an entire island grows its food, got reversed specifically to make room for one species to come back. That's an enormously difficult thing to achieve anywhere. Changing how thousands of people farm, sustained over years and decades, isn't a quick policy announcement. It's a slow, community-wide commitment, and Sado followed through on it. It's also worth sitting with the timeline of despair and recovery because it's genuinely unusual in conservation history. Most stories of species push this close to extinction end in P. Permanent loss, the dodo, the passenger pigeon, which went from billions of individuals to 0 in a matter of decades, the Yangtze river dolphin, functionally declared extinct in the 2000s. Once a population drops into single digits, recovery is exceedingly rare and successful. Self-sustaining wild recovery is rarer still. The crested ibis is one of the small handful of species that beat those odds. Not through luck alone, though luck certainly played its part in those 7 birds being found at all. It succeeded through decades of sustained, deliberate occasion. Ally, slow, and unglamorous work. Careful, captive breeding. International cooperation between 2 countries that don't always see eye to eye diplomatically. And, critically, an entire farming community fundamentally changing its relationship with the land, specifically to make space for a bird to come home. Today, if you visit Sado Island, you can watch crested ibises foraging in rice paddies, exactly as their ancestors did centuries ago, before overhunting, before pesticides, before the population collapsed. Down to a number you could count on 2 hands. The Toki Forest Park on the island now serves both as a conservation facility and a place where visitors can see the species up close and learn the full history of how close it came to disappearing entirely. The crested ibis went from being an ordinary common sight across an entire region to functionally extinct across 3 countries, down to just 7 known individuals anywhere on Earth, and back again to hundreds of free-flying, wild-breeding birds on the very island where its story in Japan very nearly ended for good. 7 birds. That's how close an entire species came to being nothing more than old paintings and folklore. And that's exactly how far a genuinely committed, decades-long recovery effort managed to bring it back.